Hello, you are listening to the Chapter 29 audio of To Kill a Mockingbird plus some commentary. Now, Chapter 28 was pretty wild. We see that Bob Ewell goes after Atticus's children. Jem and Scout are on their way home from the pageant. They're walking by themselves, and then Bob Ewell attacks them. And we see that Jem winds up with a broken arm. His arm is broken very badly at the elbow. We also see that Bob Ewell attempts to suffocate Scout, and he squeezes her really hard. We also see that there was another man that comes onto the scene, and we hear some scuffling, and then the man grabs Jem and carries him back to the Finch house. We don't know who this man is. Scout doesn't recognize him, and he's standing in Jem's room at this point. We also see that Jem is passed out, and they're waiting until morning to wake him up. At the end of Chapter 28, Hecate comes in and reveals that Bob Ewell is dead under the big oak tree, and he has a kitchen knife stuck up under his ribs. All right, let's jump into Chapter 29 on page 358. Aunt Alexandra got up and reached for the mantelpiece. Mr. Tate rose, but she declined assistance. For once in his life, Atticus's instinctive courtesy failed him. He sat where he was. Somehow I could think of nothing but Mr. Bob Ewell saying he'd get Atticus if it took him the rest of his life. Mr. Ewell almost got him, and it was the last thing he did. "Are you sure?" Atticus said bleakly. "He's dead, all right," said Mr. Tate. "He's good and dead. He won't hurt these children again." "I didn't mean that." Atticus seemed to be talking in his sleep. His age was beginning to show. His one sign of inner turmoil, the strong line of his jaw, melted a little. One became aware of the telltale creases forming under his ears. One noticed not his jet black hair, but the gray patches growing at his temples. "Hadn't we better go to the living room?" Aunt Alexandra said at last. "If you don't mind," said Mr. Tate, "I'd rather us stay in here if it won't hurt Jem any. I want to have a look at his injuries while Scout tells us about it." "Is it all right if I leave?" she asked. "I'm just one person too many in here. I'll be in my room if you want me, Atticus." Aunt Alexandra went to the door, but she stopped and turned. "Atticus, I had a feeling about this tonight. This is my fault," she began. "I should have—" Mr. Tate held up his hand. "You go ahead, Miss Alexandra. I know it's been a shock to you. And don't you fret yourself about anything. Why, if we followed our feelings all the time, we'd be like cats chasing their tails. Miss Scout, see if you can tell us what happened, while it's still fresh in your mind. You think you can? Did you see him following you?" I went to Atticus and felt his arms go around me. I buried my head in his lap. "We started home. I said, 'Jem, I've forgotten my shoes.' Soon as we started back for him, the lights went out. Jem said I could get 'em tomorrow." "Scout, raise up so Mr. Tate can hear you," Atticus said. I crawled into his lap. "Then Jem said, 'Hush a minute.' I thought he was thinking. He always wants you to hush so he can think. Then he said he heard something. We thought it was Cecil." "Cecil?" "Cecil Jacobs. He scared us once tonight, and we thought it was him again. He had on a sheet. They gave a quarter for the best costume. I don't know who won it." "Where were you when you thought it was Cecil?" "Just a little piece from the schoolhouse. I yelled something at him." "You yelled? What?" "Cecil Jacobs is a big fat hen, I think. We didn't hear nothing. Then Jem yelled, 'Hello' or something, loud enough to wake the dead." "Just a minute, Scout," said Mr. Tate. "Mr. Finch, did you hear them?" Atticus said he didn't. He had the radio on. Aunt Alexandra had hers going in the bedroom. He remembered because she told him to turn his down a bit so she could hear hers. Atticus smiled. "I always play a radio too loud." "I wondered if the neighbors heard anything," said Mr. Tate. "I doubt it, Heck. Most of them listen to their radios or go to bed with the chickens. Maudie Atkinson may have been up, but I doubt it." "Go ahead, Scout," Mr. Tate said. "Well, after Jem yelled, we walked on. Mr. Tate, I was shut up in my costume, but I could hear it myself then. Footsteps, I mean. They walked when we walked and stopped when we stopped. Jem said he could see me because Mrs. Crenshaw put some kind of shiny paint on my costume. I was a ham." "How's that?" asked Mr. Tate, startled. Atticus described my role to Mr. Tate, plus the construction of my garment. "You should have seen her when she came in," he said. "It was crushed to a pulp." Mr. Tate rubbed his chin. I wondered why he had those marks on him. His sleeves were perforated with little holes. There were 1 or 2 little puncture marks on his arms to match the holes. Let me see that thing, if you will, sir. Atticus fetched the remains of my costume. Mr. Tate turned it over and bent it around to get an idea of its former shape. This thing probably saved her life, he said. Look! He pointed with a long forefinger. A shiny, clean line stood out on the dull wire. Bob Ewell meant business, Mr. Tate muttered. Quick pause here. So the fact that there is a shiny, clean line on the dull wire, that indicates that the wire had been cut. So most likely Bob Ewell had attempted to stab Scout through her costume. And that's why Mr. Hectate says that the costume probably saved her life. Let's continue reading on the bottom of page 360. He was out of his mind, said Atticus. Don't like to contradict you, Mr. Finch. Wasn't crazy. Mean as hell. Low-down skunk with enough liquor in him to make him brave enough to kill children. He'd never have met you face to face. Atticus shook his head. I can't conceive of a man who'd... Mr. Finch, there's just some kind of men you have to shoot before you can say Heidi to 'em. Even then, they ain't worth the bullet it takes to shoot 'em. Ewell is one of 'em. Atticus said, I thought he got it out of him the day he threatened me. Even if he hadn't, I thought he'd come after me. He had guts enough to pester a poor colored woman. He had guts enough to pester Judge Taylor when he thought the house was empty. So do you think he'd have met you to your face in daylight? Mr. Tate sighed. We'd better get on. Scout, you heard him behind you? Yes, sir. When we got under the tree. How'd you know you were under the tree? You couldn't see thunder out there. I was barefooted, and Jem says the ground always is cooler under a tree. We'll have to make him a deputy. Go ahead. Then all of a sudden, something grabbed me and mashed my costume. I think I ducked on the ground. Heard a tussling under the tree, sort of. They were bamming against the trunk, sounded like. Jem found me and started pulling me toward the road. Mr. Ewell yanked him down, I reckon. They tussled some more, and then there was this funny noise. Jem hollered. I stopped. That was Jem's arm. Anyway, Jem hollered and I didn't hear him anymore. And the next thing, Mr. Ewell was trying to squeeze me to death, I reckon. Then somebody yanked Mr. Ewell down. Jem must have gotten up, I guess. That's all I know. And then Mr. Tate was looking at me sharply. Quick pause here. So Scout thinks that maybe Jem got up and pulled Mr. Ewell off her, but that doesn't seem to track with what had actually happened. We know that after Jem's arm breaks, we don't hear from him again, and we can make the assumption that he is most likely passed out at this point. So it has to have been the other man that yanks Bob Ewell off of Scout. All right, let's keep reading on page 362. Somebody was staggering around and panting and coughing fit to die. I thought it was Jem at first, but it didn't sound like him, so I went looking for Jem on the ground. I thought Atticus had come to help us and had got wore out. Who was it? Why, there he is, Mr. Tate. He can tell you his name. As I said it, I half pointed to the man in the corner, but brought my arm down quickly, lest Atticus reprimand me for pointing. It was impolite to point. He was still leaning against the wall. He had been leaning against the wall when I came into the room, his arms folded across his chest. As I pointed, he brought his arms down and pressed the palms of his hands against the wall. They were white hands, sickly white hands that had never seen the sun. So white they stood out garishly against the dull cream wall in the dim light of Jem's room. I looked from his hands to his sand-stained khaki pants. My eyes traveled up his thin frame to his torn denim shirt. His face was as white as his hands, but for a shadow on his jutting chin. His cheeks were thin to hollowness. His mouth was wide. There were shallow, almost delicate indentations at his temples, and his gray eyes were so colorless I thought he was blind. His hair was dead and thin, almost feathery, on the top of his head. When I pointed to him, his palms slipped slightly, leaving greasy sweat streaks on the wall, and he hooked his thumbs in his belt. A strange, small spasm shook him, as if he heard fingernails scrape slate, but as I gazed at him in wonder, the tension slowly drained from his face. His lips parted into a timid smile, and our neighbor's image blurred with my sudden tears. "Hey, Boo," I said. All right, so that's the end of chapter 29. That last line always gets me, where Scout realizes that it's Boo Radley in the room, which also means that it was Boo Radley who left his house and left the safety of his house to save the children here. So we see that the book really is coming full circle now. We find out why Jem broke his arm, which is brought up on the very first page of the book. We also see Boo Radley come into the story, and Boo Radley has been the children's obsession since the start of our story. So that is the end of chapter 29. If you have any questions, make sure you're reaching out to your teacher.